r/nosleep. Posted by you/likeeyedid. My neighbor spends every day repainting his house. Jeremiah Jones is nothing if not the perfect example of the most stressful neighbor you could imagine. A perfectionist with artistic tendencies, however, I suppose he only ever got them because he is so addicted to the need of having everything right and clean at all times. I don't believe he was always like this. Before his wife passed away you would hardly see him outside at all. Except for when he came home from the office in his shiny Volkswagen. And now he has all this time. Time that he uses for cleaning and renovation, and this almost daily. He's gotten older and stopped working, though his retirement money should be more than enough after all those years of work. I'm not sure though. My mother says it is awfully rude to speak about money. Especially other people's money, but that's dumb, it's just paper after all. Maybe being alone and having time is what evoked this hobby or addictive habit of his. Their house was never ugly or dirty when his wife was still there, but she was only out there occasionally. He is far more excessive with his approach. Anyway, Jeremiah Jones was so addicted to perfection that he wouldn't even take a chance of his home having any sign of dirt on the outside. And I mean that quite literally. It's not as if he watches for a bird or a tree to leave a nasty little mark so he can climb up and paint. No, he is constantly taking precautions matters by painting the roof and the walls every single day. Excessive, isn't it? Well, at the beginning it wasn't that entirely insane just yet. The neighbors even thought that it was a nice habit he had found to distract himself a little. You would see him out there with a big can of blue paint and he was humming while painting the left side of the building. A few days later the entire house was blue and it looked kinda cool. An ocean blue home isn't something you see every day. He smiled and he waved when I watched him from our porch. I waved back and even asked if he needed some help, but his smile swiftly disappeared. No, you would just do it all wrong. When I frowned at his words he picked his smile up again and added, I'm just awfully nitpicky, you know. I nodded and went back inside. The day after he had finished painting it all blue, he was outside again at 5 a.m., when the birds weren't even up just yet. I awoke from the sound of something heavy, loudly hitting the pavement outside our door. I instinctively jumped out of bed and looked out the window to see what it was, and while my mind wasn't that sharp just yet, so early in the morning, I clearly saw blood. It was dripping down the window of Jeremiah Jones and there was a big puddle of it on the floor next to the house. I screamed and shouted for my parents to call an ambulance. Terrified, they ran to my room, and as the three of us took another look, we realized that what I must have seen was red paint. Our neighbor was outside again, and the sound I heard must have been a can of red paint falling to the ground and spilling paint. The kind that he was using to go over the former blue walls. I suppose he had forgotten to paint a white layer first, as the color certainly didn't look as fresh and bright as the blue of yesterday. It looked messy and dirty. My parents walked outside that morning and talked to him, but I didn't hear what they said. I suppose they told him not to scare me in the morning. Mum was rather furious that he had to start painting so awfully early in the morning. When they came back inside, however, her anger had turned into concern. Poor man must be terribly missing Julie, she whispered. That was his wife's name. Julie Jones. Is this why he's painting so much? I asked her. Mum shrugged. She did love that home and she always wanted things clean. I suppose it's a tribute. Jeremiah spent the following days going over the walls and the roof until it was bright red, and not rusty red, like crusty blood. In the afternoon, when I had just gone inside, I casually walked by and took a sniff of the wall, simply to prove to myself that it didn't smell of iron. I know I was tired in the morning, but I could have sworn I saw blood and not paint. However, all that caught my nose were the chemical scents of layers of paint. The following day, I woke up by sounds from my never-tiring neighbor again. This time nothing was falling, but he was humming a familiar song. I looked outside, and when I saw him with another can on the top of his ladder and a colored tassel in his hand, I only rolled my eyes and snuggled back into bed. His humming turned into whistling and I didn't get another minute of sleep. In the afternoon, Mum sent me next door with a casserole she had baked earlier that day to make up for her rude attitude towards Jeremiah the day before. She had even talked to other neighbors and many were worried for the old man. Being so lonely and alone. Many went over to offer their help or have a chat. He often loudly joined in the chats but never accepted any help. It was his work to do. When I went over with the lasagna that Mum had made, he smiled and climbed down the stairs. Tell your mother thank you, but that wasn't necessary. It must be awfully annoying to live next door to a construction site, he joked. I chuckled. Oh no, that's fine. I really did like the blue, though. The home was now painted in a rather dark color, a mixture of forest green and brown. I thought she would have too, he said in a sad tone, and I assume he meant that his wife would have liked it. I wasn't sure what to say at that moment, so I asked, was blue her favorite color? Mrs. Jones had given me piano lessons when I was younger, and I remembered the wall behind the piano was ocean blue. I thought it was, he said with a half smile. Though maybe it's not. He was saying those words as if he had painted the house to please her. Maybe that was what he was trying to do, an act of grievance, and maybe if he found the right color he would be able to move on. I nodded sympathetically and let him continue with his work. I felt bad for being mad at him. He was only trying to find the perfect color after all. The next day it was yellow, and he had started even earlier in the day when it technically was still night. Yellow was the most unfortunate choice because the dark layer the house currently had wasn't accepting of such a light color, though he didn't seem to care and used up at least a dozen cans of yellow paint before noon. After lunch, I went outside and asked why he didn't put up a layer of ground paint first. I wasn't exactly a professional painter, but it seemed logical to me. Because it doesn't matter, he answered in a harsh tone. It will always shine through. Then he proceeded to hum loudly, and I quickly went back home. Sympathy quickly turned into worry when he wouldn't stop for weeks. Every single day he was out there. Especially after it rained. What a fortune he must spend on all this paint. He must have sold out every hardware store in town. The layers must be incredibly heavy by now, my father said during breakfast. And it didn't seem as if Jeremiah was even enjoying his work. Dad, how did his wife die? I asked. I knew she had passed away very suddenly, but I didn't know any specifics. Das looked uncomfortable. Well, you see. Mrs. Jones had some health issues, but they weren't physical. He mumbled a few more words, but my father was never good at talking about serious topics. What I could make out of what he said, however, was that she had taken her own life. Inside that house. If Mr. Jones was the one who found her, I suppose that explained his trauma even more. Especially if he never had much time for her. He even spent nights coming home very late from work. I suppose he was trying to make up for things in hindsight. It made me feel even worse for him. However, while his coping mechanism seemed to be helpful at the beginning, it clearly didn't seem healthy anymore. While he used to be happily humming and whistling during his daily activity, it now sounded forced and wrong. He would become louder and more crooked. The song, however, was still the same. And it was loud enough that we could hear it at our kitchen table. The same melody that sounded awfully familiar, but not like something I would usually listen to. Even the song, Dad said as if he was reading my mind. Wasn't that the one Mrs. Jones once taught you on the piano? Black. That was the last color he used on the house. The darkest shade of black I'd ever seen before. He must have ordered it online as it was a new and unfamiliar brand. And while he had been cautiously and carefully painting each day before, he now had lost all motivation to do a clean job. He was splashing and pouring the dark color everywhere. Layers on layers of dark paint dripping from the walls. Neighbors had gathered again. It was evening by then, and Jeremiah Jones was still outside with black splashes all over his clothes and face. Some tried talking to the man, who looked as if he hadn't been sleeping in days, but he ignored them. If he answered, then only by saying nonsense. And that's when I wondered if something else had happened to his wife. Something he had been spared so far because he didn't spend enough time in that cursed home. His wife didn't seem that unwell to me, but I'd only been interacting with her during my piano days, which were a long time ago. However, she was certainly a little nitpicky herself. Possibly the time inside the home alone during those last years had taken a toll on her, and now that he was spending all his time at home, it was getting to her husband. I tried telling my parents, but they only gave me sympathy smiles for talking about a cursed house. Still, I was convinced there was something going on inside that place, and what I saw the night after the house was painted all black proved my suspicions. It was late at night. Mr. Jones had gone back inside just an hour back, and the whole street seemed to be sleeping. It was eerily quiet, as it is most nights on Campbell Street. Most people that live here are rather old and boring and go to bed very soon. So I must have been the only one awake, unable to sleep. Maybe it was because I heard our neighbor hum and whistle each day, but I simply couldn't get that melody out of my brain, until I realized it wasn't inside my head. There was a faint melody playing from outside. In the dim street light, the Black Jones's house was disappearing into the night. There was no light on the inside that I could see, but there was music playing. Very quietly. I'm not sure how to explain my next set of actions. Maybe I was still half asleep and not thinking well enough, but somehow the music got me so incredibly curious that I put on my sneakers and my jacket and walked out to our lawn. The melody was slightly more audible outside, but still very faint. I doubt it was really coming from the inside of the home. I knew Mrs. Jones had given her piano away many years ago, and the sound was not coming from Mr. Jones. I mean, Of course, he could have been listening to it online or on CD, but I could swear that the music was coming from the walls, not from the inside. I swallowed and took a step closer, now wondering if I was completely out of my mind. I can't quite explain why I felt so drawn to it. Eventually, I had my ear pressed against the outside of the house and immediately moved it away again. As if doing what I was in that moment wasn't dumb enough already, I had forgotten that the house was freshly painted and therefore wet. I rubbed my face, expecting to see black on my hands, but the gooey substance on my skin was something else. This time it really did smell like iron. "The walls are bleeding," I whispered to myself, and that's when the window closest to the wall I was standing by opened up wide. The creaking of the wood sent a shiver down my spine and I fell back to the ground. "What are you doing?" Mr. Jones hissed. He was trying to be quiet, I could tell, but his eyes were bloodshot and he looked more terrifying than I'd ever seen him before. "Do you want to join her? Is that what you'd like?" he added. I stumbled back, both afraid and ashamed. I couldn't even explain what I was doing there. I came here almost involuntarily, as if something was calling me. I opened my mouth to say something, but Jeremiah Jones was already grabbing the frame of the window, ready to climb out. The manic expression on his face was only growing worse. I tried to scream, but I was entirely in shock. Our neighbor had always been so kind and polite before the recent events. I was afraid the house had turned him insane. I tried to get up from the dirty ground, but Mr. Jones was almost outside, ready to jump me, and I swear he would have if the commotion hadn't woken someone else up too. Or maybe it was the fact that I wasn't lying in bed as I should have been, but when I heard the footsteps of my parents running towards the lawn and shouting, I was saved. Saved from whatever Jeremiah Jones had planned. More neighbors woke up and the police were there soon. At first, Mr. Jones's explanations were sounding crazy, just as crazy as my idea of a cursed house. "It's bleeding. It's bleeding. It's bleeding and singing. She won't stop bleeding. She should have stopped." I will never know how any of what happened was possible. I still wonder if I really heard the music and saw the blood, because nobody else seemed to have noticed. Nobody but me and our neighbor. Jeremiah Jones saw the house bleeding each day, which is why he tried to paint over it. Maybe it was a punishment, or maybe she tried to warn us and nobody saw. Because how could anyone have known that she didn't do this to herself, but that he was the one who made her bleed?